Welcome, students, to your Module 7 lecture video. Let's jump right into your Module 7 checklist. The assigned readings for this module include Chapter 7 on painting, Chapter 23 about the art movements that occur between the world wars, and Chapter 24, which covers the post-war modern movements in art. Of course, you will be responsible for watching this entire lecture video, which will be a long one, so you might want to break it up into 2 watching sessions. You'll need to take consistent lecture notes and respond to the question prompt at the end. And of course, you will be responsible for participating in one last discussion reading forum, in which you will complete your initial post within 5 days of the lecture video becoming available, and then you will respond to 2 of your classmates' posts in the discussion forum. And I just wanted to give you a reminder to start working on your final projects. Also, I apologize, I have a little case of the sniffles. So, moving right along, let's jump right into the content of Chapter 23. So, in the last module, we talked about how the world was changing in the early 20th century and about art movements that responded to these changes, as well as some that responded to fears about the tense political circumstances that would eventually lead to World War I, and about artists that built on and expanded the experimentations of the post-impressionists. This chapter picks up after the end of World War I and focuses on how its devastating effects changed politics and culture by looking at the art movements that developed during the interwar period. So with a closer look at European countries, since they experienced the kind of devastating effects more than their American counterparts, we'll talk about Dada, Surrealism, explorations in Cubism, Constructivism, and several more movements in which the artists chose to express their perceptions of the catastrophic events of the war. Many of these artists had been silenced or threatened by governments if they tried to create or react to the horrors of the war. Some of them were forced to fight, and some of them were even killed. So after the war, many artists used their art to protest the conditions, the climate that led to war, and others used it to propose new conditions or ideas for a new world, hopes for a better world. So it was very common during this period to use art as a tool to improve society. This period also marked this kind of proliferation of European innovations in art throughout non-European countries, and namely for our purposes in the Americas. So we'll start by looking at the Dada movement, which basically emerged in reaction to the most brutal war that the world had seen up to that point, which is World War I. Millions of people died during this war because each side was using the latest killing technology like machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, and fighter aircraft. Basically, attacking in any direction was suicide. Battle movements were pretty much frozen because of trench warfare. So, the Dadaist movement, which was both artistic and literary, responded to this insanity with a strong rejection of tradition, moral, political, social, and aesthetic traditions. This is because they believed that because the world of reason and logic and rational behavior resulted in the disastrous effects of global warfare, that the only path to salvation was through political anarchy, or the irrational, and absurdity, and intuition. These qualities are even reflected in the name of the movement, which was supposedly selected at random from a French-German dictionary, meaning, quote, a child's hobby horse in French. This name filled the desire for something nonsensical and irrational. And it's important to note that rather than being one identifiable style, that Dada was more like a general mindset or attitude. So let's explore how this played out in some examples of Dada art. While horror and disgust about the war was the initial provocation for Dada, there was often an undercurrent of humor and irreverence running through much of the art. And you can see that quite clearly here in Marcel Duchamp's treatment of this postcard reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, that kind of humor and irreverence. So Duchamp was probably the most influential Dada artist, working primarily in New York, but also in Paris. So, and Duchamp, of course, was the artist who portrayed Nude Descending a Staircase that we talked about before. So Duchamp painted a mustache and a goatee on the Mona Lisa. So why, though, did he do this? It was intentionally a slap in the face of the traditions of art and art history and the function of art in the Western world. Duchamp was basically saying, how can art help or contribute to a world that brings such carnage and brutality? His intention was to wake people up out of this kind of blind acceptance of traditional values, and to, he wanted them to start thinking for themselves, and also to note this kind of commodification of art. So this work of art, yes, it is a urinal. It also exemplifies that current of irreverence and of nonsense. And this is an example of what Duchamp called a ready-made. Ready-made sculptures were typically common mass-produced objects, most often found objects that the artist would select and then deem them art by modifying them in some way or by combining them with another object. So here it's very clear that what we have is a urinal presented laying on its back, signed with a fake name or pseudonym, one R. Mutt. And the title of this work is Fountain. Duchamp said that ready-mades were created free of any consideration for good or poor taste, which were these qualities that he and other Dada artists shunned because they felt that those distinctions came from a society that was morally and aesthetically bankrupt. So this was a pretty aggressive approach to making art. These works also exemplify the tendency of Dada to emphasize spontaneity and chance in this kind of arbitrary selection of objects. So, your book includes this ready-made on the far left by the artist Man Ray as well, who was a practitioner of Dada, but also surrealist art. And his objects, like this one, are generally less well known than his photographs. But this piece, which is called Gift, or the translation is Gift, is really a combination of Dada and surrealism. But we'll focus on the aspects of the former. So what we see here is actually a replica, and this is because many early works were either lost or destroyed, and the same goes for Duchamp's works. But this piece consists of a typical iron that had to be heated on a stove, and it has been transformed into a non-functional, almost disturbing object by the addition of this row of nails, of 14 nails. And he made it on the spot in the gallery that was hosting the opening of his first solo exhibit in Paris. So he glued the nails to the iron, and apparently it was stolen that very afternoon. But he made several more like it eventually. And I've included just a couple more images of Man Ray's ready-mades that we won't really discuss, but I just wanted to provide more visuals for this movement and for his work. So the last artist that we'll look at of the Dada movement is Hannah Höch, who practiced in Berlin. And Dada took on a very political edge in Berlin, partially as a response to the economic, social, and political chaos of that city during and after the end of the war. In particular, Dada artists in Berlin further developed the collage process that the Cubists had experimented with, but they called their process photomontage. This technique was different from synthetic cubism in that it used found pieces almost entirely. And remember that the Cubists often drew elements or painted elements into those synthetic works, synthetic cubist works. Photomontage used pieces of paper and images from magazine photos and newspapers and combined them into these kind of deliberately irrational, illogical compositions. This process lent itself well to that Dada desire to use chance and spontaneity. So Hannah Höch's works perfected this technique, but they also often provided commentary, mostly negative, about topics like women's social roles, industrial society, and this kind of explosive growth of mass print media. In this work called Cut with the Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epic of Germany from 1920 to 21, Höch arranged this very eclectic mix of photos that she cut out of those sources I mentioned, and she places them in this kind of haphazard manner. But if you look closely, you can see that she's actually very carefully placed photos of other Dada artists among these images of Karl Marx and Lenin and other revolutionary figures in that lower right corner. She's included the word Dada as well, and she's juxtaposed these elements with the heads of German military leaders kind of affixed to female bodies, exotic dancers at that. So you can see the element of humor is at play, even though the mood of Berlin Dada and of photomontage is really one of more direct critique of society. The work on the right is called Dada Dance from 1922, and it speaks to Höch's focus on women's issues more specifically and the effects of mass media. So the status of women in Germany supposedly improved after the war, but the newswoman or the woman in the news was still widely discussed in German news media. And so Höch's contribution to this discussion was quite critical. This work seems to ridicule the ever-changing demands of fashion and beauty that women were expected to follow. The composite figure on the right wears a fancy dress and high fashion shoes, and she's kind of posed in this over-the-top kind of curtsy, which is a highly feminized pose. And she exists in great contrast to the graceful African figure on the left, who probably was meant to represent a more natural kind of beauty, as a comment to say all of this kind of overly dressed, overly done fashion is ridiculous. But this message isn't exactly overt. It's more of an interpretation, which is common to much Dada art. So let's now transition to another art movement in which meaning isn't exactly clear upon first glance. And we're talking about Surrealism. So like Dada artists, the Surrealists also rejected and protested the rational emphasis of Western culture. Many Surrealists participated in Dada prior to their involvement with the Surrealist movement. The movement's founder or leader, André Breton, grew restless with what he felt was an unfocused bitterness of the Dada movement. So he broke off from Dada in pursuit of a more organized and focused response, and wrote something called the Manifesto of Surrealism that outlined his take on Freud's idea that the human psyche or mind is always in conflict with itself, in the battle of rational consciousness versus the irrational or instinctual consciousness. So Surrealists were interested in dreams and fantasies and hallucinations, all of which manifest from that unconscious mind. Many Surrealists employed what's called automatism, and they also used these or created these kind of unexpected juxtapositions. We talked about this way earlier in the semester when we talked about Merritt Oppenheim's object. It was discussed in terms of texture, but also we talked a little bit about its surrealist qualities. So many works of surrealism are abstract, but there are just as many representational works to boot. So let's look at some examples. Now, Max Ernst is one of the first artists to evolve from a Dada style to the Surrealist style, and he's recognized as one of the first practitioners of the frottage technique, and frottage is the French word for rubbing. So this technique is when an artist takes a drawing utensil and rubs a medium over an uneven surface to create strong textural patterns that would often be developed into or inspire finished works of art like these. The original rubbing became this group, or this, the image in the top left of entangled creatures. This is the one from your book. That's why I referred to the top left. So these creatures are kind of monstrous and mythical, and this work contains a kind of premonition of violence that would eventually become a central theme of Ernst's later work. His experience in combat is believed to have influenced this violent, recurrent theme. So these works are considered realist in form and content because the frottage method is akin to automatism, and because the subject was fantastical, it kind of is this dark fantasy from the recesses of Ernst's mind. And so all of these are from the Horde series, and they were all created in this similar way of this frottage method. Now, René Magritte is another surrealist artist, one that we've seen before. We looked at his piece, The Treachery of Images, early on. Many of his other works of art also display this kind of playful humor and mind-teasing ambiguity. Through the combination of these highly realistic images and absurd juxtapositions, he produced several works of art that rendered commonplace things in strange and unfamiliar, illogical ways. In The Lovers, we see two lovers trying to engage in a kiss, but a barrier of fabric prevents the embrace. The addition of this material creates a kind of scene of frustration and isolation. Some interpretations suggest that this work comments on the inability of humans to ever fully unveil the true nature of even our closest, most intimate companions. And as you can see, there is an obscured face in the figure in the painting on the right as well. And some critics suggest that these enshrouded faces appear as a result of Magritte witnessing his mother's body being fished out of a body of water with her nightgown wrapped around her face when he was only 14. But Magritte denied this correlation. So my apologies for not IDing the Treachery of Images up in the top left and then the Son of Man work on the far right. I didn't identify them in the slide, but The Son of Man is a much later work by the artist, created in 1964 as a self-portrait. Now, this work is probably one of the most iconic surrealist works of art, appearing in various formats, including books and films, and even supposedly this sticker that is specifically designed to fit over the Apple logo of a Mac. So apparently it's like a little bowler hat like he's wearing. This is how we end up, though, with the bizarre placement of the apple in front of the figure's face. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I apologize. One of Magritte's friends actually commissioned a self-portrait of the artist, but Magritte had trouble painting his own portrait. So this is how we end up with that apple in front of the face, because he couldn't paint himself. So we do see his left eye poking through. The man also seems very out of place and overdressed for the setting that he's in. And there are some strange details to note in the position of his left arm. The elbow seems to point in the wrong direction. And in his own comments about the painting, Magritte mentioned that the conflict that can arise between the visible that is hidden and the visible that is present. So if that's confusing to you, you're not alone, because Magritte was not interested in solving mysteries, and so his work, as is much surrealist work, is just kind of bizarre, and there isn't a clear meaning. So basically, Magritte suggests that the viewer might be both curious and frustrated about not being able to see the face that is obscured by the piece of fruit. How does it make you feel? Now, another important surrealist artist is Jan Miró, and he engaged in a more abstract style of surrealism, and most of his finished works were a product of that automatism that I mentioned, but I haven't exactly taken the time to explain it yet. So automatism refers to the uniquely surrealist approach to making art in which the artist suppresses conscious control and performs actions kind of unconsciously or involuntarily, such as doodling or scribbling, and the results of which, even pouring paint on a canvas, the results of which might sometimes yield a chance accident in which the artist could further develop an idea or something like what precisely actually what Max Ernst was doing with his Horde series. And in these works by Miró, we see the results of this technique, where the artist has developed imaginary creatures out of random shapes. Now, painting is the title of the work up in the top left. And he actually started this work by creating a collage of assembled fragments cut from a catalog for machinery. And he then took the shapes and reshaped them into these black silhouettes or outlines and added accents in white and bright red. So this work, as many others, doesn't actually have a deeper meaning or story. They're just kind of spontaneous and intuitive manifestations of the unconscious. So the work along the bottom seems to have a bit more narrative to it, and we get that right away from its long title, Woman Haunted by the Passage of the Bird Dragonfly, Omen of Bad News. Now, the bold colors and organic or biomorphic shapes are typical of Moreau's style, but the dark or haunting quality was not. The three interlocking figures here create a sense of tension, aggression, and fear. Strangely enough, this work was displayed in a nursery for years, despite this kind of spooky quality. And it was painted after the signing of the Munich Agreement, in which European leaders tried to appease Hitler to avoid the outbreak of World War II. And Moreau's sculpture in the top right seems a kind of odd assortment of objects, clearly rooted in Dada sculpture, but hits on provocative themes about death and disorientation very intentionally. Now, we cannot cover Surrealism without mentioning Salvador Dali. Dali is probably the artist or the name most synonymous with the Surrealist movement. So if it's not already clear by looking at this work, The Persistence of Memory, the artist was a master of traditional methods, of illusionistic representations, so his surrealism falls into the representational category. So Dali's manner or style was this paranoid critical method in which he reveals kind of deep psychological conflicts. Now, in The Persistence of Memory, we see the manifestation of the artist's fears about the passage of time. In other works, we see themes of urges and confusion, like in Birth of Liquid Desires. We get the feeling that Dali thought that he might be able to gain a bit of control over these thoughts if he could portray them for others to see and relate to. In this work, we see a woman in a white gown embracing a hermaphroditic figure, which is one that has both male and female organs. And this figure kind of halfway kneels on a pedestal with its foot in a bowl of this mysterious liquid, which another figure is pouring. And all the while, a loaf of bread is sitting on top of the central figure's head. Like, even describing this work of art presents a challenge to logic. So we also have this thick black cloud emerging from the bread or the head. And you could really go on and on. The artist really expresses and paints without any semblance of reason. So now we'll talk a little bit about how artists expanded on Cubism through two artists and the movements they were involved with called Purism and Suprematism. Purism was actually developed by Le Corbusier, which is a very important modern architect and also a painter, in opposition to synthetic cubism. And Corbusier felt that synthetic cubism had become too esoteric, which means kind of like out in left field or understandable by only a select group of people. And he also felt that it was decorative and out of touch with the machine age. And purists maintained that machinery's clean, functional lines and pure forms should direct artistic experimentation. Suprematism was a more abstract development that was meant to convey a belief that the supreme reality in which the supreme reality in the world is actually pure feeling, and it's attached to no object. So this work by the French artist Fernand Léger actually blends elements of synthetic cubism with the aesthetic ideals of purism. Early on, Léger painted in a strictly cubist style, but eventually he came up with this compromise or combination of styles. He combines the meticulous cubist analysis of form with purism's simplification and machine-like aesthetic qualities. In this quite large 7x9 work, we see hints of the modern poster. We see the suggestion of harsh lighting and traffic and kind of robotic movement. And his rendering of this cityscape is kind of a riot of vibrating color and shape and movement. This is a later work by the artist, which you'll notice right off the bat differs from the previous because it contains figures. But other qualities of this work have remained consistent, of his work rather, and such as the smooth machine-like components and the cylindrical modeling, the bright colors. This work is thought to be a defining work by Léger, the result of over 100 preparatory studies. And this is really from a different time period, but I just wanted to show it because it's very vibrant and fun, and we might not get a chance, well, we definitely won't get a chance to look at Léger again. So this work really celebrates the leisure activities of the working class, which is evident in the depiction of cyclists and country outings and circus figures. So it really shows that the world of 1954 was very different than the world in which the city or the previous work was created, or rather really different from other works of the interwar period. Now, let's look at the work of Kazimir Malevich to try to begin understanding the suprematist movement. Malevich's belief in pure feeling as the purveyor of this essential reality, and therefore the essential art, led to a need for new, non-objective forms in art, shapes that were unrelated to the objects of the visible world. And he said this about suprematism, open quote, "To the suprematists, the visual phenomena of the objective world are in themselves meaningless. The significant thing is feeling," end quote. So the basic form of Malevich's new non-objective art was the square. It was often combined in various ways with lines and rectangles. In suprematist composition Airplane Flying, brightly colored shapes float in the white space in relationship to one another, though, and he believed that this art would be easily understood as the pure language of shape and color, to which viewers would respond intuitively. So what then is the viewer supposed to respond to in suprematist composition white on white? This was one of the most radical compositions of its day. While the subject of the work, or the content of the composition, if you will, has no relationship to reality, we do see evidence of the artist's hand in the texture of the paint and these kind of subtle changes in the shades of white. You can also see that the square isn't perfectly symmetrical or straight. You can think of it as a kind of pure expression of geometric form. So, just to remind you, these artists in the interwar period sought new forms of art making in an effort to make the world a better, more secure civilization. And in the U.S., the onset of the Great Depression in 1929 also motivated artists to serve society. So what is constructivism? Well, it was this revolutionary and very influential art movement that flourished in Russia in the early 20th century. And it was mostly practiced or developed by a group of artists who supported the goals of the radical socialist revolution of the Bolsheviks that had taken Russia out of World War I. So the constructivists borrowed ideas from Cubism, also suprematism and futurism. But it was really a completely new approach to making art objects. And they wanted to do away with the traditional artistic concern with composition and replace it with construction. Rather than concerning themselves with aesthetic issues, these artists were concerned with building, with modern materials like plastics and metal and wire and plywood. They wanted to create useful objects and to promote societal goals. They were a completely new variety of idealists. So artists like Alexander Rodchenko were committed to moving out of the artist's studio and moving into a more factory-like setting. He came to believe that painting and sculpture didn't contribute enough to practical needs. He actually declared the death of painting one time in 1921 after he exhibited 3 monochromatic canvases, one in each primary color, which he said this about, open quote, "I reduced painting to its logical conclusion and exhibited 3 canvases, red, blue, yellow. I affirmed, it's all over. Basic colors. Every plane is a plane, and there is to be no more representation." End quote. Perhaps a bit pompous, but he turned away from painting nonetheless and moved toward a utilitarian or toward more utilitarian creations like books and textiles, theater sets, and furniture. He also made several posters in support of the Bolsheviks and the New Russia, which served essentially as socialist propaganda. Your book features the Workers' Club from 1925, which was a room originally designed for the Soviet Pavilion, which was basically a reading room in which the ideal Soviet mind could develop. It was designed with ease of use in mind, and it was constructed primarily of wood, since Soviet manufacturing was particularly equipped to work with wood. So note that the design of those chairs, there are 2 photographs, 2 different views of this room, or the Workers' Club. So note that the design of the chairs is meant to keep the body erect, in proper posture. Rodchenko hoped that this physical effect would infiltrate the morality and the spirit of the sitter as well as his mind. Your book also mentions Popova in terms of constructivism, but her work is really less constructivist and more like an offshoot of suprematism and cubism, and you can read more about her in your book. But I did want to show you the work of one more constructivist just to get your eyes a bit more familiar with this style. This is an early example of installation art by the Russian artist L. Lissitzky called Pro-Un Space, created originally in 1923. This is a photograph of a 1963 reproduction. This word Pro-Un was an acronym for the phrase Project for the Affirmation of the New in Russian, which was essentially part of the political efforts to establish a new socialist society in Russia. He created many Pro-Un works, including paintings, prints, drawings, and installations like these. This abstract room was a mock-up for an inhabitable... I have to sneeze, I'm sorry. This abstract room was a mock-up for an inhabitable space or living space. The artist rejected conventional painting tools as well in favor of mechanical instruments. And Rodchenko did the same thing. And it's because they found them too personal and imprecise. The highly engineered aesthetic of these spaces was meant to encourage precise thinking amongst people. And Lissitzky, too, eventually made propaganda posters and photographs. So next we'll look at Distill, or aka neoplasticism, which was essentially the Dutch counterpart to constructivism. This means it's developed in the Netherlands, specifically Holland. But this art Distill was even more simplified, at least aesthetically. So the group was founded by Theo van Doesburg. Do you remember the Abstraction of the Cow series that we talked about early in the semester? Well, it was that artist, Theo van Doesburg, and Piet Mondrian, the latter of which is basically the quintessential artist associated with the style. Excuse me. And on the topic of style, that is literally what Distill translates to, the style. And this name is evocative of the idea that Doesburg and Mondrian thought they were working in the style, not just a style. They thought it was the ultimate, epitome of style. Or rather, a kind of universal or art, or the ultimate aesthetic. It was very rational, and it would appeal to a higher order, or speak to the underlying structure of all existence. Yeah, pretty lofty. But according to Distill artists, their artistic vocabulary was very simple. It involved simple geometric elements and rejecting naturalistic representation. And they did this because they hoped to restore order and balance to daily life after World War I. They also believed in progress of machines, specifically to facilitate ease of living. So what do you see here in Mondrian's Tableau 3 with orange, red, yellow, black, blue, and gray? It's this stripped-down composition consisting of straight lines, rectangular planes, and primary hues. You'll also notice use of the three neutrals, white, black, and gray. So from about 1920 onward, Mondrian's paintings all depict this same essential formal vocabulary. And Mondrian called this his pure plastic art, hence the other name for this style, which is neoplasticism. Also, I meant to say that Mondrian limits himself to strictly horizontal and vertical lines and planes. He felt that primary colors were the purest colors and therefore the most conducive to producing harmonious compositions. And by limiting his works to these slightly altered grids of intersecting horizontals and verticals, he attempted to maintain a kind of dynamic tension. He felt that curving lines appealed to too much to sensuality, which was in opposition to the rational, the universal beauty that the Distill artists believed in. So there is basically defined by geometric forms, primary colors, which were meant to yield universal harmony. We haven't talked tons about architecture, but architecture during this period also saw new forms and a new visual language, and many were inspired specifically by the style that we've been learning about. So these images of the exterior and interior of the Schroeder house, designed by Gerrit Rietveld exemplify de Stijl in the third dimension. This structure is an important example of what came to be known as the international style, and he took Mondrian's idea of dynamic tension and equilibrium and applied it to the entire house. And you'll notice that he also works in Mondrian's characteristic color palette. This asymmetrical exterior of these interlocking gray and white planes of various sizes and the sporadic placement of accents were radical innovations in architecture. And notice the yellow details on the side of the chair. The room can actually be divided as well by these sliding partitions that can change the space from a sleeping area to a working area or an entertaining area. And the patron for this house actually came up with the idea of those sliding partitions. She was very wealthy, but rather than wanting a house of luxury, she wanted her home to evoke sleek elegance and austerity, or simplicity and restraint. I'm so sorry. So, lastly, it's important to note that de Stijl artists believed that art and life were one, and that art should therefore be incorporated into living environments. So, to elaborate a little further on the tenets of the international style, let's think for a moment about these three fundamental principles. Firstly, the emphasis of these structures should be on volume rather than mass. So what does this mean? The use of a steel skeleton as the basic structure and reinforced concrete made it possible to eliminate load-bearing walls on both the interior and the exterior, allowing more open floor plans and more light-filled interiors. And it allowed buildings to be wrapped in skins of glass, metal, or brick, creating the effect of enclosed space or volume, rather than dense, solid, multi-walled structures. And then, like in Corbusier's Villa Savoie, secondly, the structure in the international style, structures in this style were designed with regularity rather than symmetry. And this was a way to create orderly design. So basically, this means that you see regular or repeated shapes or supports or other building parts throughout the structure, often rectilinear, rather than emphatically symmetrical designs across the vertical axis. This sometimes led to or even encouraged an overall asymmetric disposition. And the third principle is the rejection of applied decorative elements. The result is a sleek, clean appearance that stands in great contrast to the natural environment. So, essential to its design is the architect's belief that the house should be a machine for living in. So, this house, by Corbusier, is clearly lifted off the ground. It has this flat roof that could serve as a garden and a terrace. It has an open floor plan, ribbon windows, incredible spatial planning, including this series of ramps and a spiral staircase that connects each floor. The lower levels are utilized for maintenance, and living quarters are on the upper level, and there's also this huge terrace on the first floor as well. So, and there's plenty of space for appliances in this home as well. So, and it was actually listed as a historic monument while the architect was still alive. So let's move on to discuss some of the ideas and the developments in art of this era that are highly politicized. So we'll start with an artist we're pretty familiar with by now, which is Picasso, and this is his Guernica of 1937. In 1937, the Spanish government was in exile in Paris while a civil war was in progress, and they asked Picasso to create a major work of art for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris International Exposition that summer. So he knew that this would afford him a wide audience, but he didn't accept the invitation until he heard that the capital of the Basque region, which is this area in southern France and northern Spain called Guernica, had been almost completely destroyed at an experimental, because of an experimental bombing or practice by Nazis. And they were attacked during the busiest part of the day, too. It was all executed simply to demonstrate military power. So 1,600 civilians were wounded or killed as Guernica burned for 3 days as a result of the world's first incidents of saturation bombing. This event jolted the artist into action, and by the end of June, roughly 3 months after the attack, Picasso had completed this mural-sized work, measuring approximately 11.5 by 25.5 feet. Despite its title, Picasso made no explicit reference to the actual bombing. Instead, he creates a menagerie of figures and activity that kind of cries out in grief and anguish. So, stretched across the bottom left half of the canvas, we see a dead warrior clutching a useless broken sword. A horse tramples him as he rears back in fear. On the left side, we see a woman crying out in pain with her dead child cradled in her arms. A woman on fire runs away from the right side of the composition. Another flees mindlessly. A bull on the left overlooks the entire scene, representing brutality and darkness. And what do you make of Picasso's style here? Well, we're obviously looking because of its political content, but its style is indebted to Cubism. And this is because the fragmented aspects of the objects and the dislocation of anatomical features are recurring style elements from Cubism. In this case, the distortions of form may actually parallel what might have happened to these figures in real life, unfortunately. Picasso's palette of black, white, and gray also evoke the kind of severity and or sincerity of the event. It helps induce feeling and expressiveness. So that very gritty work sets us up perfectly to discuss social realism. This kind of art varied from country to country, but most, if not all of them, include a more accessible style than many of the other modern movements we've been discussing. And this is particularly because these artists wanted to reach the public, to communicate with them about social causes and issues. We're going to skip the parts from the book about social realist art as communist propaganda and jump right over to Mexican social realism. And we'll mostly be talking about Diego Rivera, about this specific movement, who was the husband to Frida Kahlo. Now, a few quick notes about most social realist artists. They generally thought of themselves as workers or laborers, as critical members of society rather than as elites. And Diego Rivera was a huge proponent of the social and political role of art in the lives of common people, and he wrote extensively about the proper goals for an artist, each of which he met in his Mexican history murals. Mexican muralism was a state-sponsored movement that arose after the overturning of a dictatorship in the early 20th century. And this movement, these murals, were meant to tell national history, tell about culture and espouse these kind of post-revolutionary ideals in large-scale murals in public spaces. So to achieve these, or to make these murals, Rivera used the old school fresco technique to create very attention-grabbing, heroic visions of Mexico's past. Your book shows the liberation of the peon from 1931, and it displays a horrific scene in which a laborer, who has been beaten and left to die is cut down by sympathetic revolutionary soldiers. They tend to his body with compassion. A peon was basically an indentured servant under Spanish colonizers. So this imagery also alludes to Descent from the Cross, expressing tragic freedom at the moment of death from that indentured servitude. Now, one of the artist's greatest murals, called Man Controller of the Universe, was originally planned for New York City in part of the Rockefeller Center. And Diego is commissioned to paint this mural on the theme Man at the Crossroads, looking with hope and high vision to the choosing of a new and better future. When Rivera proposed including a portrait of the communist leader Vladimir Lenin, the Rockefellers objected, and even after he offered to add Abraham Lincoln and some other abolitionists to kind of balance it out with more acceptable figures, they canceled the job, paid his fee, and destroyed the unfinished mural. So ultimately, Diego recreated the work in Mexico City. And there's a lot going on in this work. In the center, we see the man who controls the universe. And how does he achieve this feat? How are we to interpret this? Well, it's through technology. So the two ellipses behind him represent living organisms, as seen through the microscope at his right hand, and outer space as seen through the large telescope above his head. So we also see the efforts of man's agricultural pursuits in the fruits and vegetables growing in front of the man. To his left, we see Lenin joining the hands of several workers of various races. On the opposite side, we see capitalist decadence, people playing cards and smoking. These figures are very intentionally placed below the these figures are placed very intentionally below the diseased cells in the ellipse, including a depiction of John D. Rockefeller. Further left, we see the workers of the world embracing socialism. And on the opposite side, we see the militaristic effects of capitalism. Work like this one inspired federal art programs in the United States, including the federal art program that was a part of the New Deal, which was the recovery program for the nation after the Great Depression. And it was meant to provide relief to the unemployed and help revive the nation's economy. So the FAP, or the Federal Art Project, ran from 1935 to 1943, and it included about 10,000 artist participants, leading to approximately 108,000 paintings, 18,000 works of sculpture, 2,500 murals, and thousands of prints, photographs, and posters. All of these became government property since they paid for it, and this art reached a wide audience because the work was posted in public buildings, like train stations and schools and hospitals and post offices. So to build, or to raise funds rather, for federal assistance or federal assistance to those in need, the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, hired photographers like Dorothea Lange to document the problems of farmers or migrant farm laborers These photos would then be provided to magazines and newspapers for free to help spread awareness. You probably recognize the image on the right. Its full title is Migrant Mother, Nipomo, California, but it's often shortened to Migrant Mother. It depicts Florence Thompson, this 32-year-old mother of 7, who had gone to California for work after fleeing the conditions of the Dust Bowl of the Great Plains. When she arrived, she wasn't able to find work because the crops had frozen, peas specifically, onto the vine. So the look of worry on her face seemed to capture the fears of an entire group of people going through the same struggles. The photograph on the left shows 3 families camped out behind a billboard advertising train travel. It's kind of ironic, too, that these poor families were probably never going to be able to take a train trip. So, nonetheless, it was this convenient place for them to camp because it provided protection from the wind. So photographs like these really help to spread awareness and garner sympathy, kind of like Jacob Riis's photographing the slums of New York City. So I'm going to skip around a little bit, and we're going to talk about American regionalism. So during the Great Depression, American regionalists turned away from European modernism to embrace subject matter that was local and distinctly American, mostly about rural communities and depictions of the everyday. These artists were responding to a kind of isolation that they felt was engendered by modern art. They felt that it was foreign and out of touch with the American spirit. They worked on developing both a national and personal identity and hoped to convince the American public that art mattered. So let's talk about Grant Wood first. Clearly having rejected modern avant-garde art, Wood was inspired by and tried to emulate the clarity and precision that he saw in Northern Renaissance art, like Jan van Eyck or Albrecht Dürer. And he usually depicted these archetypal rural or agrarian subjects that conveyed the values of hard work, community, and austerity. So American Gothic is one of the most recognizable works of American art from the 20th century. So what's the subject? Well, there's a youngish woman in conservative clothing whose eyes are averted. And then we have this bald-headed man wearing glasses and overalls with a collarless shirt, looking out squarely at the viewer, holding this old-fashioned pitchfork, which is not just to us, but to the time, it was old-fashioned. We have this modest white home with a decorative Gothic window, and the curtains echo the female's dress, and the prongs of the pitchfork echo the details of the house and the window, and that pale striped shirt as well. Most people assume this is a married couple, but Wood said it was actually meant to depict a father and daughter. And apparently, the Chicago Evening Post published a photo of this work the night before it debuted, and it caused a bit of an overnight sensation effect. People weren't sure if Wood was making fun of these people or not, and so it really raised the question about what exactly is American art about, or what exactly is American about this work of art. Why do they seem so miserable? Is this commentary on American identity or Midwestern identity? Does Gothic simply refer to a window? Some people feel like that it was meant to make fun of like a narrow-mindedness of Midwesterners, but it kind of remains ambiguous. It's been the subject of numerous parodies as well. And then the work on the right, Young Corn, we talked about earlier in the semester in terms of rhythm in works of art. So I just wanted to include that here for your reference. So let's also talk about Thomas Hart Benton. He was probably the most popular, influential American regionalist, and he vehemently opposed modern art. And he used his art to protest the KKK, lynching, fascism, and those terrible things during the 1930s and 40s. His style is very easily recognizable by its exaggerated curvilinear forms and shapes and the use of these really bold colors. So in the work on the left, the ballad of the jealous lover of Lone Green Valley, Benton illustrates a popular folk song and set it in the Ozarks. And the models are his friends and family. The man in the foreground even is modeled after his student Jackson Pollock, who we'll talk about in a bit. So as the story goes, a man stabs his wife because of supposed infidelity, only to later find that his suspicions were unfounded. This work exemplifies the artist's devotion to, his lifelong devotion to, the admiration of music. And the other work, Palisades, from your book, deals with the arrival of the first settlers to America and their conflicts with indigenous people. And it was from a series, an unfinished series, called American Historical Epic, that focused on the shared experiences and struggles of ordinary people rather than great feats or abstract concepts that were the subject matter of so many murals. But in both these works, you can see his characteristic undulating forms and vibrant colors. Eventually, the American regionalist style accrued a backlash and fell out of favor abruptly as these various totalitarian governments across the world employed social realism as propaganda, which we hinted at with Rodchenko and Lissitzky. So figurative art like that, created by the American regionalists, quickly became tainted. So artists that continued working in that style were kind of marginalized in the U.S. So now let's move on to the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And again, just remember we're talking about interwar period art movements, and the artists associated with this movement encouraged the celebration of Black life and identity. It also inspired a rising consciousness about inequality and discrimination, and expressed interest in the changing modern world. Many of these figures were expressing themselves through art for the first time, and their efforts really helped to dignify Black life and counter these kind of derogatory caricatures from pop culture, and to really expand the history of Black experience. So we're going to start by talking about Aaron Douglas, who is often referred to as the father of African American art. Before landing in New York in 1924, he studied in Nebraska and Paris, where he practiced landscape painting and eventually was introduced to Cubism. So while in New York, Douglas became this highly sought-after graphic artist, using bold colors and stylized forms to depict motifs derived from West African masks and sculpture. He actually combined these colorful themes in a unique version of synthetic cubism that emphasized transparent, angular planes. The image you see here is from the Aspects of Negro Life mural series that was commissioned by the Public Works of Art Project to decorate the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. In creating this work, Douglas was also responding to the ideas set forth by Alan Locke, who was the intellectual leader of the Harlem Renaissance. He proposed that Black artists should seek their artistic roots in the traditional arts of Africa. So let's talk about what we see in this work, From Slavery Through Reconstruction, from that series. First off, you might notice that all of the figures are the simplified, silhouetted people in profile. Notice that the eyes are rendered frontally, like in Egyptian reliefs and frescoes. He also limited his color palette to only a few subtle hues, although they appear in both light and dark variants of those hues. Notice these kinds of concentric bands of color that seem to suggest musical rhythms or perhaps even spiritual emanations. So some of these details convey that objective of looking back to the African past. Other details convey connections to more recent historical events. For instance, the group of figures at the right celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Some of those concentric circles emanate from the figure holding the document. The central figure symbolizes black leaders of the Reconstruction era, encouraging other figures, some of which are picking cotton, to cast their ballots. You might notice that that main figure is pointing to a distant silhouette of the Capitol building, and there are more circles emanate from the ballot in his hand. And the left-hand side of the panel is a bit darker and grimmer. You can see in the distance that Union soldiers are leaving the South in that very faint depiction. And then members of the KKK appear forebodingly at the far left. Despite this part, however, the main mood of this mural is hopeful. So this is a slightly earlier work that features even fewer colors. Here we see a palette of mostly greens with a little blue. And I didn't mention this before, but while these transparent overlapping geometric planes suggest the influence of Cubism, the limited palette might also reflect a pragmatic choice rather than a stylistic one, because fewer colors meant lower publication costs, allowing his work to proliferate and spread more readily. The simplification of figures might also lend itself to easier understanding, extending to children even. But as the title suggests, this work features the silhouette of Harriet Tubman in the dark green, with her arms stretched upward, revealing a broken set of chains. So what's another prominent similarity between this work and the last? Well, it's those concentric circles. To her left, we see a kneeling figure still in shackles, looking up. Other figures in the background carry large loads across their backs. In contrast, the area to the right features figures kneeling and sitting and standing, one of which reads a book. Another holds a hoe. At the far right, three shapes indicate tall buildings that are reminiscent of skyscrapers. So if it's not clear already, this work can be read from right to left, left to right rather, as a narrative from slavery to the efforts of the abolitionists, to the Civil War, and then emancipation. And then on the right highlights opportunities and accomplishments. Douglass's work defined a new narrative for African Americans, a new self-determination that stood in stark contrast to depictions of African Americans as dependent on white society. And I just wanted to point out that the cannon, that there is a plume of smoke emanating out of it at kind of the base of Tubman's body. The cannon is what is meant to indicate the Civil War. So, this, you won't be able to click on the link that you see here in the image, but I'm going to include this link in the description of the video on YouTube because I want you to watch it. It's about 11 minutes long, and it's about Jacob Lawrence's Great Migration series. For the sake of time, we are not going to watch it right now. So let's move on now to the post-war movements in modern art. I want to go over a little cultural context that leads to this explosion in the art world. And we can't do that without establishing the political climate. And we also can't do that without me getting a sip of water because I am very thirsty. So, the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the world's most powerful nations, and they were soon engaged in the Cold War. This is basically the era in which the U.S. tries to put a stop to communism as Soviets set up communist governments all over Eastern Europe. And then Mao comes along in 1949 and establishes another huge communist government as the People's Republic of China. And eventually the U.S. tries to stop the spread of communism in both the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. So all of this trickles into or affects the art world eventually. We also see the development of massive nuclear arsenals in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And we see gradually the withdrawal of various European states from colonized countries like India and parts of Asia and Africa. So, like in the interwar content, many of these post-war artists use their art to comment on the climate of the world or the state of things. And we see an even greater increase in mass media after World War II that helps everyone, including artists, be better informed about these international affairs. Additionally, modern artists after 1945 continued to move away from tradition, but they were less focused on turning away from Renaissance standards because these had already been left in the dust. They instead started questioning more and more the nature of art itself, meaning they created works as experiments in form or challenged the boundaries of art. So lastly, the devastation of World War II far exceeded that of the First World War. I mean, Germany lost 5 million people. 6 million Jewish people died during the Holocaust. Russia lost 20 million people. And there were about 40 million refugees and displaced people across the continent. So most European artists in the post-war period were trying to come to terms with what they had experienced. And many of these European artists actually moved to the United States at the outbreak of the war. So by 1941, Mondrian, Dali, Leger, Max Ernst, and André Breton were all living in New York, where they had a huge impact on the art scene. So American artists working in abstract styles were inspired by Surrealism and its practices of automatism. Remember, those are those techniques free from conscious thought. And they evolved from this inspiration into the abstract expressionist style. Now, this style yielded a wide variety of work that pioneered many innovations in materials used, methods of application, compositional structure, and the size of the work itself. The abstract expressionists are generally grouped into two camps, and that is the group of action painters and a group of color field painters. And we'll talk about artists from each group. So first, let's talk about Jackson Pollock. Keep in mind that while these paintings are abstract, they're also felt to express the artist's state of mind, with the goal of also striking an emotional chord in the viewer as well. So we've heard this a few times by now. The artist hopes that the viewer will respond instinctively or intuitively. Another name for this action painting style is gestural abstraction, just so you know. A phrase that makes a lot of sense when viewing Pollock's work. His work exemplifies this style best, and he develops it in the 1940s and refines it by the 1950s. These works consist of rhythmic drips, splatters, and dribbles of paint. They're often mural-sized works. This one's about 8 by 17 feet. I'm talking about Autumn Rhythm 30. And because of this, these fields of pigment often envelop the viewer. Not only were the final compositions unlike anything the world had seen before, but the way that Pollock created these works was also completely new. Rather than just sticking to brushes or in traditional oil paints, Pollock often opted for sticks, trowels, knives to drip and fling paint. He used aluminum paints and household enamels as well. And perhaps one of the most crucial differences in his technique from traditional ones was the way that he unrolled his canvas across his studio floor, rather than stretching it across a frame. This allowed him to move around his canvases and even feel like he was in them. And sometimes he even mixed other materials into his paint to make a heavy impasto. Now, a heavy impasto is a thick application like Van Gogh used. And he would mix the paint with bits of sand or broken glass or other foreign materials. And these methods led to a kind of derisive nickname for Jackson Pollock, and that was Jack the Dripper. Pollock was also known for not naming his works until after they were completed, which is in line with the very avant-garde quality or emphasis on the creative process, and that a work only develops as a result of the process rather than from a preformed idea. Unfortunately, Jackson Pollock died in a car accident at age 44, cutting short the further development of his very unique artistic vision. Another abstract artist, abstract expressionist that we have to talk about is Willem de Kooning. Here we see more expressive brushwork, a very energetic application of paint, slashing lines, these kind of agitated patches of color, and strange irregular shapes. The work on the left, Woman 1, took the artist about 2 years to complete, believe it or not. His wife, Elaine, who is also an artist, said that she thought de Kooning painted the canvas about 200 times of different images of women that he would scrape away and start again each day. So what do we make of this? We can infer that process was probably very important to de Kooning as well. So what do we see here in both of these works? Well, we see these kind of ferocious looking women with grotesque, toothy smiles, and these very large, awkwardly depicted breasts and disturbingly wide eyes. They're kind of monstrous, and much of his work, whether there is a figure portrayed or not, has this raw, intense quality. And then we have Lee Krasner, which your book mentions briefly in terms of her untitled work from 1949, the one on the far left. It's a part of a series called Little Images from the late 1940s, none of which were larger than 3 feet, and each of these is from that series. She made them on a tabletop in her bedroom, and she used more controlled, repetitive brushstrokes than de Kooning and Pollock. Sometimes she squeezed paint directly onto the canvas from the tubes. The result in this work is this kind of grid-like composition filled with marks that are indecipherable, that she likened to Hebrew letters, which she studied as a kid but couldn't exactly recall. But she was more interested in creating a language of private, abstract symbols that didn't have one specific meaning. I just love the work on the far right. And I also love this work, and I just included it here so you could see more of what her work looks like. And your book doesn't mention this, probably very intentionally, but I wanted to tell you anyway that Lee Krasner was Jackson Pollock's wife. And, Frank probably doesn't mention this because Krasner was long overshadowed by her husband and his legacy, even though she was an established abstract artist before she met him. So this work is kind of more raw and gestural than the Little Images series work. It's a bit somber and menacing as well, probably because the title suggests it, and also because of the color scheme. So now let's look at some color-filled painters, but first a little info about it. In contrast to the kind of aggressive tendencies of the action painters, the color-filled or the chromatic abstractionists, if you will, work is much calmer and quieter. These artists were responding to what they felt was a spiritual problem in modern society, and they so hoped to create a modern mythic art that would inspire contemplation or a meditative state by creating large areas of color, primarily one color. Let's first look at Barnett Newman. He specialized in monochrome canvases like his most famous work that you see here, Ser Heroicus Sublimis, that are only broken up by one or more vertical lines that he called zips. And I selected this image of the work so you could get a sense of scale. Like Pollock's work, color-filled paintings like this one tend to kind of engulf the viewer. Newman's hope was to create a modern experience of the sublime for the viewer. If you remember the sublime, it's kind of what J.M.W. Turner was trying to do with his romantic work, but through an abstract means. The translation of this title reinforces that objective, and meaning man, heroic, and sublime. Newman wondered if modern science had so demystified the world that people were no longer able to feel or sense the sublime, and he wondered if this led to the desire to feel or sense the sublime that could only be achieved with war and slaughter. So his art and many others sought to connect people to that sense of awe and a kind of transcendence through their art practice. Now, perhaps the name most synonymous with color-filled painting is Mark Rothko. He created very compelling visual experiences that were usually made up of 2 or 3 large rectangles of pure color with these hazy, brushy edges that appeared in a way to kind of float on the surface of his canvases. The shapes appear like shimmering veils of intense, luminous colors that hang in front of the canvas rather than as parts of them. But Rothko wanted these works to be much more than dazzling color combinations. He hoped that they would move people, even to tears. He said this about those kinds of reactions, open quote, "The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them, and if you, as you say, are moved only by their color relationships, then you miss the point. End quote. Rothko saw color as a gateway to another reality. And he was certain that it could convey basic human emotions like tragedy, ecstasy, and doom. So, like other abstract expressionists, Rothko's work relied on the evocative potential of formal elements of painting rather than the representational subjects or narratives of them. And I actually filmed this portion of the Phillips Gallery, the Phillips collection rather, when I was in DC. So I just wanted to play that for you very quickly. There was no way that I could capture how incredible they were. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you because it was really fantastic. So, now, your book also mentions the work of Helen Frankenthaler and Robert Motherwell. Much of Frankenthaler's work is characterized by this stain aesthetic that she achieved by pouring thinned paint directly onto raw, unprimed canvas laid on her studio floor, and she worked it from all sides to create the effect of the floating fluid shapes that you see here. This work, Mountains and Sea, of 1952, marks the beginning of a series of works like this that have a soft color palette and an expressive use of color. Motherwell's work is defined by his interest in automatic writing and drawing as influenced by the Surrealists. And his most well-known work is the series Elegy to the Spanish Republic, one of which we see here, number 34, that he worked on from, the series rather, he worked on from 1948 to 1967. These were meant to be a visual lamentation or funeral song after the Spanish Civil War. His recurring motif is this black oval, roughly rendered and repeated in various sizes, shapes, and states of distortion. They usually appear against a ground of even, upright, mostly white rectangles. These works were a kind of private insistence that terrible deaths had happened and shouldn't be forgotten. But Motherwell also suggested that they act as metaphors for the contrast between life and death. Now, we've covered a lot on on abstract expressionism, and rightfully so. But let's look at developments in architecture in the post-war years as well. The international style was still dominant at this time, with its sleek exteriors and rejection of historicism. Most American architects that adopted the style went with simpler, box-like designs, rather than the asymmetrical planes that were so popular in earlier years. The Lever House in Midtown Manhattan in New York City set the standard in this style for office buildings for the next 25 years, and it's often referred to as a glass box skyscraper. It was designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in the style of Mies van der Rohe. It was one of the first glass-walled office buildings in the international style in the country. And it was a style characterized by the phrase, form follows function, meaning that practicality was the first concern. Efficiency. These buildings often show their structural supports and are devoid of any ornamentation. But like everything else, designers began to grow restless with what came to feel like a limiting style. So the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer adopted some characteristics of the glass box design, but added elements of decoration like the addition of concrete, graceful curves, and accents of primary color.
In Planalto Palace, the example from your book, up in the top left, you'll know that the ramp leading to the entrance looks a bit impractical. The windows on the end, however, look like they're borrowed from the international style. But the curving struts of that external skeletal structure are solely decorative in nature. I've included a couple of other examples, fun examples, that showcase Niemeyer's style too. So first, there's the National Congress Building in the top right image that's made up of a low rectangular structure topped by a dome on one side where the Senate works, and then an inverted dome on the other where the Chamber of Deputies works. And then there's a second structure looming in the behind, which is a pair of towers that house various governmental office spaces. And then at the bottom left, we have a much later structure. So it doesn't really fit into our period here, but I just wanted to show you. And it's a museum meant to honor the architect's own work. It's informally known as Niemeyer's Eye. So the ocular structure there that you see is actually an annex, while the long, low, linear structure is the actual museum. So now we're going to talk about assemblage artists. This group of artists, like so many that came before, decided that they wanted to rebel against the New York School artists, meaning the action painters and the color-filled painters, or that umbrella term, which is the abstract expressionists. They felt compelled to reconnect art with the real world and move away from the very personal, creative processes of the abstract expressionists. The assemblage artists, as well as other groups we'll talk about, thought that while the abstract expressionists produced really innovative work, they were still mostly bound to tradition in their use of traditional media, like paint, canvas, metal, and wood. The abstract expressionists also worked in a very serious manner. Their spirits were heavy with the effects of war. They were trying to heal themselves and fix the crisis of human spirituality. Assemblage artists, and also happening artists and pop artists, were of a younger generation who didn't feel the psychological effects of the war so intensely. Instead, they saw an ever-increasing materialistic society develop as the world healed from the war's destruction. So, the most innovative artists of the 50s and 60s sought to reintroduce the real world into art and often worked in a more playful, less serious mode. One really important influence on these artists was actually not a visual artist, but an avant-garde composer named John Cage. One of his most significant musical innovations was to introduce random sounds of noise from everyday life into his work. He didn't express his feelings in his work either. Rather, he set up these different situations that would allow unpredictable events to occur. He was very influenced by Zen Buddhism, which teaches that enlightenment can occur at any moment, even ideally during one of his spontaneous compositions. Likewise, assemblage artists began combining random objects into strange compositions without any predetermined meaning, but rather in a way to see what meanings might emerge from the finished work. The first artist we'll discuss from this group is Robert Rauschenberg, who was a student of John Cage's at Black Mountain College near Asheville, North Carolina. Rauschenberg also studied with Willem de Kooning, one of the action painters that we just looked at. One time he asked de Kooning for a drawing that he had created, and in order to express the way that he felt about that older generation of artists, Rauschenberg erased it. He erased de Kooning's drawing. And this, of course, he did with the artist's permission, but it should indicate to you his kind of irreverence and lighthearted spirit about artistic practice. Now, so about Rauschenberg's work. Monogram is the name of the work that you see on the left, and it is also the piece featured in your book, although this is a different view of it. It belongs to a series of what Rauschenberg calls combines, or combine paintings, that actually merge elements of sculpture and painting into a completely unique kind of artistic product. So what the combine does or achieves is a disruption of the traditional picture plane as an extension of the viewer's space, or as a window to another world. So the focus of this work is the stuffed Angora goat that Rauschenberg found at a thrift store in New York for $15. He brought it home to his studio, where he worked on it to 3 different states of completion. And we know this because he documented each state with drawings and photographs. He derived the name from the final state that you see here, with the tire placed around the goat's middle section. Rauschenberg said that their interwoven relationship reminded him of the letters interwoven in a monogram, and it standing on top of this chaotic collage-style painting. The work on the right is Canyon from 1959. It features an array of family photos, public images, like the one of the Statue of Liberty. It also includes pieces of political posters and various other objects, either purchased or found in the trash. So, we also have a taxidermy eagle here, and we have a flattened steel drum that he found in the trash up in the upper right corner. These images and objects are placed somewhat disorderly amongst brushstrokes and drips of paint, pieces of wood, paper, and other bits of detritus. So Rauschenberg said this in 1956, one of his earliest statements about combines, open quote, "I consider the text of a newspaper, the detail of a photograph, the stitch in a baseball, and the filament in a light bulb as fundamental to painting as brushstroke or enamel drip of paint. In the end, what one sees as my work is what I choose to make, with no guarantee of enlightenment, humor, beauty, or art." Another essential assemblage artist is Jasper Johns, who met Rauschenberg in New York in the mid-50s. His work is very different from the complex and chaotic work of his fellow artist. His works are pretty controlled, they're emotionally cool, they're very cerebral, even while they appear to be quite simple. With his work, he sought to draw attention to common objects of the world that he thought were frequently, quote, seen, but not really looked at. So most of Jasper Johns' work revolves around these common objects like flags and numbers and targets and alphabets. The work that you see on the right, for example, is Flag from 1954 to 55. And you might immediately notice the highly textured surface of the painting. This is because Johns created it with the encaustic method, which is an ancient method of painting with liquid wax mixed with dissolved pigment. So you're literally painting with wax, colored wax. Beneath the stripes, but if we were in front of the work of art, beneath the stripes, we could see that he painted with the encaustic over a collage of newspaper scraps and photographs. And the dates of these scraps locate this very common symbol within a particular moment in history. The other work is called Target with Four Faces, and it's from 1955. And the main focus of this piece is obviously the concentric circles, or these alternating bands of blue and yellow, or a target. Johns described a target as something the mind already knows, and he felt that by selecting a well-known or easily identifiable image that he could explore new possibilities for painting. At first glance, the works might not look very different than actual objects they recall, or depict. But upon closer look, the viewer will notice the visible brushstrokes in the paint application and the underlying collages. And then you have that band of faces above the target. They were cast in plaster over the course of several months, and he used a neighbor as his model. So it's an interesting juxtaposition to place the faces next to the target. And I wonder if it conjures up any particular reaction for you. Does it remind you, does it seem threatening that a target would be placed so closely to faces? Nonetheless, and just remember, again, these works were not put together with any predetermined idea. It was meant to conjure up ideas after the fact. So this attention to common objects and odd juxtapositions kind of harkens back to Dada, but it definitely also sets the stage for pop art that is to come. So the last assemblage artist that we'll look at is Noah Purifoy. He was actually from rural Alabama. He got his degree in social science in Montgomery, joined the Navy, eventually moved to LA, where he eventually co-founded the Watts Towers Art Center in 1964. And I wonder if you guys remember those. They were the two huge, colorful towers made by Simon Rodia, or Simone Rodia, he made them out of bent wire, tile, bed frames, and all that different materials, all without power tools. Well, that's the hub of the Watts Towers Art Center. So a year after this art center opening is when the Watts Rebellion or the Watts Riot broke out. And after it died down, Purifoy and several other artists went around collecting debris from the burned buildings to use in their assemblage art. And so Purifoy cobbled together various pieces of wood, plaster, paint, and signage to create this work that memorializes the event without celebrating it. Purifoy was 49 when he made this work. He said the event ultimately led to his development as an artist. He went on to teach school, make furniture, and work in interior design. So let's move on now to events and happenings. Again, artists from this period are interested in exploring the boundaries of what art was and could be, even to the point where works of art no longer had to be stable, static, aesthetic objects. During the late 50s and early 1960s, artists started creating these art events that involved living, moving bodies. And they're often called happenings. They are akin to assemblage art in their incorporation of the real world, but they are instead these scripted, predetermined periods of time, so they're partly planned and partly spontaneous. The first happenings took place in Japan, where an attempt at peaceful social revolution was still at play. Again, it was a post-war period for them as well. This led to a radical collapse of old values in art, being one of those areas. Some painters formed the Gutai group in 1954 to pursue the possibilities of pure and creative activity with great energy. They organized outdoor installations, dramatic displays of art making, and theatrical events. The name of the movement actually means embodiment, and most events involve the artist engaged in some kind of radical action. For example, one artist made paintings with his feet in front of an audience. Another artist, the one you see on the left here, Shozo Shimamoto, dressed up in protective clothing and eyewear and proceeded to smash bottles of paint by throwing them against a canvas laid on the floor in front of an audience, to be clear. He called this work hurling colors, and it really took Pollock's drip technique to the extreme. into the realm of performance art. On the right, you'll see a photograph of Saburo Murakami, engaged in an event he called Passing Through, in which he mounted paper onto frames and destroyed them by thrusting his entire body through them. This performance was really a rebellious act in the kind of questioning period after the war. And it was also controversial because paper was traditionally thought to be able to call forth sacred spirits in this area. And we can't talk about the happenings without talking about the French artist Yves Klein, who used naked women as human paintbrushes in his anthropometry paintings. These elaborate performances or happenings that involved him that involved the artist himself dressed in a bow tie and suit, kind of conducting these women as they covered themselves in paint, a color that he specially patented, in fact, called International Klein Blue, and then they made imprints of their bodies on the canvas. During these performances, a string orchestra played one long constant note for 20 minutes, and that was followed by 20 minutes of silence. Yeah, it sounds pretty ridiculous, right? Well, it was meant in part to be satirical, a satirical jab at the pretentiousness of action painting. Klein wrote this, open quote, "I dislike artists who empty themselves into their paintings. They spit out every rotten complexity as if relieving themselves, putting the burden on their viewers." End quote. What he offered instead was this kind of sensuous display that led to a work that he created without actually touching it himself, which was just another way of overturning what it meant to be an artist. And speaking of what it meant to be an artist, the pop artists most definitely brought that into question as well. From about 1955 to 1965, some artists made the connection between art and the real world by appropriating mass imagery, mass-produced imagery, or by using methods of mass production to respond to an ever-increasing presence of mass media. The exclusive use of mass-produced images gave pop art a slicker look than other contemporary art movements. And pop art has this kind of detached attitude about it. Also, it's kind of ironic or cynical. This is in contrast to the humor and the irreverence of the assemblage artists and the happening artists. While pop art had its heyday in the US in the 60s, it actually originated in Europe years earlier. The immediate circumstances that set the stage for this movement was the increasing prosperity brought on by the post-war economic boom. So in most European countries, the average citizen benefited from completely unheard of levels of benefits from the government, including Social Security, health insurance, unemployment, pensions. Younger artists wondered what they should do in this new cultural milieu. So one of these young artists, recognized as the pioneer of pop art style, was the English artist Richard Hamilton, who published a set of qualities that he thought London pop artists should ascribe to. The list included many of the characteristics of contemporary mass media and culture that they were inspired by and responding to. And these included popular, transient, expendable, low cost, mass produced, young, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, and designed for big business. And this list is in your book. Hamilton reasoned that modern culture and mass media had taken over the functions that traditional art had previously executed. So, for example, if traditional art showed us ideal beauty, well, advertising and pin-up photography took the place of that. Now, if traditional art used to be the primary source of commentary on society, television had taken over that function. What about heroic stories that had been shared with traditional art? Well, you could see those at the movie theater. So Hamilton's answer was that art should ironically use the same strategies as mass media. The long title of the work that you see here is borrowed from the language of advertising. Just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing? Right? It sounds like it's right out of a commercial. The man and woman you see here are in their own home, in their domicile. Hamilton called these figures Adam and Eve. And they're surrounded with brand name products, most of which are American. And there's a movie playing outside the window, and it's The Jazz Singer, which was the first movie to include a spoken word soundtrack. And the male figure holds a Tootsie Pop in front of his body. And this is what actually led to the name of the art movement, that Tootsie Pop. So it's likely that Hannah Hoax, that Dada collage artist we mentioned before, or photo montage artist, it's likely that her work influenced Hamilton in the creation of his work, but it's definitely less bitter, and it's meant to illustrate modern comfort, progress, and success, all by using these mass media images. Now, American pop art was even slicker and simpler and more ironic than British pop art. And the figure that we most frequently associate with this movement is Andy Warhol, who was trained as a commercial artist, but in 1960 he decided to pursue a career as an artist more along the path of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. Warhol's work is characterized by the use of bright colors and the use of silkscreen techniques to mass-produce works of art based on iconic images from American mass culture, such as famous celebrities, logos of big brands of consumer goods, and even easily recognizable images from the news. And Warhol worked in several different forms of media as well. He obviously made a lot of prints because that is what silk screening is by nature yields. But he also made films, digital artworks, paintings, and sculptures. So in Kellogg's cornflakes boxes, Warhol blew up and silkscreened the popular cereal brand logo onto these boxes, which he filled almost an entire gallery with. One room of the gallery was actually filled with the Brillo pad boxes to a similar effect. And then the next room had the Kellogg's cornflakes boxes in it. And that show was actually held in 1964. The photo is a restaging of only some of those boxes. And there were hundreds filling an already small space. And people lined up down the block to squeeze into this show. And they struggled not to touch them because it was as though these mass-produced boxes had suddenly become valuable because the artist said they were art. Now, in truth, they weren't actually cardboard boxes. Warhol deliberately copied the real-life counterparts, but he actually created these facsimiles or copies of them by hand. They were made of wood and silk screened with that brand name. And because they were constructed in this way, they don't open, which has helped them to maintain a polished new appearance over time, which is evident. I mean, these photos were captured 7 years after that show. And then, of course, we have to talk about some of his work centered around Marilyn Monroe's image, perhaps the most easily recognizable images of his body of work, that or his Campbell soup cans. Now, the Marilyn diptych, which you see here, and diptych means 2 panels, by the way, has 2 panels, is one of the first works in which Warhol turned away from traditional painting and toward the assembly line technique of silk screening photographic images onto canvas. I didn't mention this before, but in 1965, Warhol created a workshop to create his work, which he ironically called The Factory. So Warhol found himself fascinated with Marilyn Monroe, particularly after her suicide in 1962. The effect of this strip-style appearance of the images you see here suggests the sequential images of film, which is fitting because it's what made Monroe famous. And like her films, some are in black and white and others are in color. Warhol's fascination with fame also led to his selection of this photo of Monroe in her star personality rather than her genuine image. Frank mentions something very pertinent. That's the author of your textbook. And that it's the barrage and repetition of images from the mass media is what Warhol wanted to draw attention to. How mass media images had become the cultural landscape and our mythology. There were no more great narratives, no more religious subjects. It was just mass media. So the last pop artist that we'll look at is Roy Lichtenstein. He was the first of the pop artists to make art from the look or aesthetic as well as the subjects and techniques of popular culture. He created work that was inspired by advertisements and cartoons that featured these heavy black outlines, flat primary colors, and Ben-Day dots or printing dots that are used to create tone. The most famous of these early works were based on panels from war and romance comic books. Many people assume that he just copied right from the source, but he actually made numerous subtle but significant changes that tightened and clarified and straightened his final images. In both of these images, it's as though Lichtenstein is playing a game with the audience. And what I mean is that we know that comic book emotions are melodramatic, very unreal, but enlarging them and displaying them in this way kind of makes them seem more important and intense. So it's really pointing to this question about what's real and what's not in a media-saturated culture. Now, let's talk about the feelings that led to the next couple of movements we'll cover. Some artists saw pop art as a distraction from the basic quest of modern art, which was questioning and overthrowing the conventions of art itself. So the 1960s and 70s was another period of intense experimentation where movements abound and overlap with each other. A lot of it isn't overtly political in nature, but there is an undercurrent of questioning. In some ways, the climate in the art world parallels the social unrest of that period. For instance, the civil rights movement was occurring, protests against the Vietnam War, and the developments of movements like environmentalism and feminism. So one group of artists that develops out of this period are the minimal artists. They emerge as the dominant form of abstract art in the 1960s in New York. They wanted to remove anything and everything that was inessential to art. They completely removed the subjective and the personal. They abstained from representation, narrative, and metaphor as well, and focused solely on the artwork as a physical thing. The forms were geometric with these plane surfaces, and they frequently used industrial techniques and materials to achieve this impersonal effect. Those materials included sheet metal, aluminum, and molded plastics. Now, the minimalist sculptor Donald Judd is probably the quintessential minimal artist. His style embraced a spare, universal aesthetic that was very representative of the movement's core tenets. Judd felt that a work's power derived from its character as a whole and from the specificity of its materials. And he didn't actually make this work by hand, but had it fabricated. And several of his works look just like the two on the left. He never gave his work titles either because he didn't want viewers to infer any meaning beyond the work's colors and form. Interestingly, these two painters are not always grouped into the minimalist category, but rather a style called hard edge painting. But Frank includes them in this section because of their somewhat parallel interests in what they saw as the essence of painting, a flat surface composed with colors. These works are both defined by razor-sharp edges, clearly delineated shapes, and the paintings also contain no suggestion of depth. Frank Stella even used shaped canvases because he felt that a rectangular canvas might still be thought of as traditional or representational. Now, what about conceptual art? If you thought the pop artists and the minimalists were radical, at least they were still making things. Conceptual artists took minimalism to its logical extreme by eliminating the art object completely. Although they usually always printed something to look at, it was only usually a set of directions or a statement or some kind of documentary photograph. And the roots of this movement really trace back to Marcel Duchamp, who said that making art was really about mental activity at its core rather than physical. So taking emphasis away from the art object kept it from becoming yet another commodity or luxury item in the booming contemporary art market of the 1960s. Some artists didn't want to make works that would sell in this way and then go on to decorate the walls of the homes of the rich. Some of these artists took note of the fact that some board members at various museums were also corporate executives at companies that made capital from warfare or depleting natural resources, and some practiced discrimination. So it became important for many of these artists to make art that rebelled against the system. The most prominent American conceptual artist was Joseph Kosuth, who abandoned painting in 1965, and he believed that the use of language could direct art away from aesthetic concerns and toward philosophical musings. 1 in 3 chairs that you see here invites this kind of speculation by presenting an actual chair, a full-size black and white photograph of that chair, and a dictionary definition of the word chair. So viewers are presented with the question, which is the most real version of the chair? It was an art of ideas rather than things. So moving right along to earthworks and other site-specific works, these artists took art outside of its traditional settings. Admittedly, this idea was not entirely new because Mexican murals, for instance, were painted in public spaces that couldn't be bought or sold. But the earthwork artists and site-specific artists often made or used the earth itself as a medium. So some of these artists, still trying to avoid the art market, the traditions of art, began working outdoors to create earthworks. So here you see Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, with which he wanted to explore the relationship between constructive forces, or those that build shape and form, and destructive forces, those that destroy it. So this is a 1,500-foot spiral of stone and earth that was a platform extending into the Great Salt Lake in Utah. He used a spiral because it's one of the most fundamental shapes found in nature, in galaxies, in seashells, DNA molecules, even salt crystals. And he ordered that no maintenance be done on this work, so the water rises and falls, constantly covering and then revealing this piece. So now we're going to skip ahead to early feminist art. For the sake of time, this video is already quite long. Feminist art emerged in the context of the women's liberation movement in the late 1960s and early 70s, amongst other social groups vying for equality, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and people of various sexual orientations. The feminist movement challenged one of the major unspoken conventions of the history of Western art, which was that men dominated the scene. So feminist artists wanted to increase recognition for the accomplishments of female artists from both past and present, because they had been previously ignored and left out. They also attacked the traditional hierarchy of the arts, or fine art, like painting, sculpture, and architecture, over the crafts like ceramics, jewelry, and textiles. So some of the early feminist artists felt that creating art about being female might relegate their work to the margins forever. But Lucy Lippard, who was both art critic and feminist, asserted the following, as stated in your book. Open quote, "The overwhelming fact remains that a woman's experience in this society, social and biological, is simply not like that of a man. If art comes from the inside, as it must, then the art of men and women must be different too." End quote. So some feminist artists certainly made art about being female. One of those included Judy Chicago. So she was one of the California artists who often worked collaboratively and used media that was traditionally associated with women's crafts. This is evident in her very ambitious work, The Dinner Party, from 1979. It used craft techniques like needlework and china painting, and she used these as a way to celebrate the contributions made by women throughout history. The artwork was originally conceived to kind of host a Last Supper for 13 honored guests, which is also traditionally the number of witches or women in a coven. But with her research, she felt compelled to include 3 times that number of place settings, which is 39, because of how many incredible figures that she landed on. Now, the triangular form refers to the ancient symbol for both woman and goddess. And there are 999 additional names inscribed on the white tile floor upon which the dinner party rests. Some of those names include the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut, Georgia O'Keeffe, Virginia Woolf, Sacagawea, Susan B. Anthony, and so on. Each plate and placemat is covered with female-related imagery. The designs are actually combinations of butterflies, vulvas, and flower motifs. And the table's runners showcase traditional women's work as well, like needlepoint, embroidery, crochet, beading, patchwork. And then also interesting to note is this piece was created in collaboration with several women and some men over the course of about 5 years. And then we have Orlan. She is a very radical feminist artist from Europe who's best known for her body modification or plastic surgery that she had performed on herself in the name of art from the 1990s. But her earlier work was also controversial. She actually set up her work at an exhibit that she hadn't been invited to participate in. And she set up a photo of herself dressed as Saint Teresa, modeled after Bernini's Saint Teresa, if you remember. That was to be noted as Orlan the Saint. And then the artist herself sat behind a torso-shaped vending machine of sorts, and viewers could place a coin into that machine, or they could bring a candle to the Virgin, and then she would award a kiss to those who gave money to the vending machine. And her work was meant to inspire questions about women as commodities. So that very long lecture video is now over, And I want you to think about how the events of World War I and the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and so forth influenced art. And I want you to summarize the impact of these events on art from 1914 to the 1960s, and just provide some artists or artworks as examples. You do not have to cover each of the movements mentioned here, okay?